Well, hello, lovers of freedom. This is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, coming back with you another Saturday evening to talk about the principles of freedom. And tonight we're going to be talking about what is really quite possibly the most important aspect of all the aspects of freedom, and that's civil liberty. And I was at a libertarian function a few months ago, and somebody came up and just point blank asked me, what do you consider the biggest infringement on liberty today? And I didn't hesitate. I said, it's the enemy combatant doctrine. And, I could tell he was taken aback. He expected me to say something like, gun control or, free speech zones or censorship on the internet or, illegal NSA spying or the drug war or the welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, the IRS, and the income tax. But they all pale in significance to the enemy combatant doctrine. In fact, this is one of the things that I find kind of amusing about conservatives, because conservatives are very strong on gun rights, and their position, even though they may not realize it, they favor the enemy combatant doctrine. And so the position boils down to this, that, you're not going to take my guns away from me, or I forget what that saying goes, you're going to pry them from my cold, dead fingers or something like that. But I want you to have the right to come and pick me up, take me and my family, my wife and my children off to a concentration camp, torture us as much as you want, and even execute us, and that's all fine, just don't take my guns away from me. Well, the enemy combatant doctrine, of course, came in as a result of the war on terror, and it is the supreme power that any tyrannical government wants to achieve. I mean, this is the very essence. We often talk in terms of, we libertarians, that government is force. It's organized force. It's what Ludwig von Mises called the organized means of coercion and compulsion. Well, the enemy combatant doctrine enables the government to go out and just seize a person. Just grab a person, take them away to a prison or to a concentration camp, torture them to their heart's content, and then maybe even execute them, or just keep them in jail for the rest of their lives without a trial. Give me a power that's better than that. I mean, that's the power that dictators have relished throughout history. Just the power to go out and pick up a person. You don't like the way he's talking. You don't like his criticisms of you. You don't like the way he looks at government officials. Just go out and pick him up and cart him away and do whatever you want to him. Now, of course, the one condition that they've made here in the United States, it's not a complete power, is that they've got to be able to label the guy a terrorist. Okay? But as long as they've got that label on him that he's a terrorist, that's it. Game over. They seize the person. They can seize his wife. They can seize his children. If they're all involved in the terrorist scheme, who's ever involved in the terrorist scheme, they just can go and grab that person. Now, one of the interesting aspects of this is what's going on in the Middle East. Now, if you've been listening regularly to the show, you know, and you've been reading my blog daily there at fff.org, you've been reading my articles, you know that I'm saying to people that this situation in the Middle East holds some valuable lessons for Americans. And, unfortunately, I got a feeling that lots of Americans are just playing the superficial game. I mean, they're doing, what I said a couple weeks ago, deferring to authority. The government knows what's best. Whatever they want to do is fine with me. And so they're not really looking at the deep, profound issues that are involved here and how they relate to us. They're looking at the demonstrators and they're just sort of taking a casual, superficial attitude of, oh, isn't that nice? Demonstrations against dictatorship, and gosh, I hope the demonstrators win, and oh gosh, I'm sorry that some of them are getting killed. That's horrible. The dictator's horrible. I got other things to do. Well, if Americans do that, they're missing a valuable opportunity to get some deep lessons out of this. One of them, of course, is the U.S. government's support of these dictators. I mean, the reason these dictators have been able to remain in power and terrorize and tyrannize the people in these countries is because of the U.S. government. that's been funding them, giving them the weaponry, building up their militaries and their CIAs in those countries that are then have been used to oppress the people. I mean, this tyranny didn't just happen overnight. It didn't just happen, a month ago. It's been going on for decades. But finally it got to a point where people said enough's enough. And that's what we Americans need to do, is we need to see, now, wait a minute, what role did our government play in all this? That you can see all the hype about, Gaddafi needs to get out of power, Gaddafi needs to get out of power. But it's all just a smokescreen so that Americans don't go deeper and say, now, wait a minute, who gave the arms to Mubarak, the dictator of Egypt, and Bahrain, Yemen, Jordan, all these dictatorships, Kuwait? Where did these dictators get their weaponry? Where did they get their training? Where did they get their partnerships? The CIA enters into a torture partnership with Egypt, the dictator that they've just ousted. He was the U.S. government's partner, the Pentagon's partner, the CIA's partner in torture. Syria, they got Syria to do torture on their behalf. These are things that we need to be contemplating over here. Now, of course, the U.S. government's taking the position that, democracy is everything. Democracy is freedom. Well, if that's the case, then why have they been supporting these dictators for decades? And why do all their weaponry say made in America, made in the USA? Their rubber bullets, their real bullets, their bombs, their missiles, their tear gas canisters, made in the USA. These are things that we need to be confronting over here. And of course, the latest thing of democracy is freedom is just nonsense. I mean, democracy. If democracy were freedom, why isn't it mentioned in the Constitution even once? And as I've said in previous shows, our founding fathers, our American ancestors, understood that democracy was sometimes the biggest threat to freedom. I mean, you can see that in Iraq now. I mean, they say that people in Iraq are free now. Oh, they're free. They're free. Yeah, you don't see very many congressmen taking their little beloved junkets to Iraq, do you? When the president flies in, he has to fly into the dead of night and go secretly off to some military camp. While ironically, the Ayatollah head in Iran, he goes into the country and is out in the open, waving to the crowd, saying hello to everybody. Well, of course, now the Iraqi government is shooting demonstrators, killing people in cold blood because they're demanding their rights. And, the response of U.S. officials is, oh, well, you can elect better people in public office and maybe they won't kill you if you get your people in. So there's valuable lessons here, but one of the most valuable lessons is with respect to these anti-terrorist powers, including the enemy combatant doctrine. That one of the principal demands that the Egyptian people have been making, and were making on Mubarak, the dictator they ousted, was a lifting of the anti-terrorist legislation. Okay, now what is this anti-terrorist legislation? Well, it's essentially the mirror image of the anti-terrorist powers that the U.S. government has today as a result of post 9/11 decrees, laws, and whatever. It's the power I was talking about earlier, just the power to go out and seize somebody. That they don't like the way he looks, he's a terrorist. Or in their case in Egypt, Mubarak was justifying it under the war on drugs as well. So, he's a drug dealer. We, take him, grab him, put him in jail, torture him, keep him in there forever. He doesn't need a trial. He's guilty. We're going to punish him. This is the way we have order and stability. You hear U.S. officials talking like that, especially people in the Pentagon and the CIA, about the order and stability they yearn for. It's the order and stability of these dictatorial regimes, that they go out and they don't mess around. They see a terrorist and, man, they grab that terrorist, they grab that drug dealer, they cart him away. And it's this legislation that the Egyptian people said, we've had enough. This is tyranny. See, they see it as inherent to tyranny, which is just absolutely fascinating. Because when you come back over here to the United States, a lot of Americans are just confused over that to the extent they think about it. It's like, wait a minute. No, this is a pro-freedom device to keep us safe from the terrorists and the drug dealers and so forth. It's important that government have these powers to seize the terrorists and seize the drug dealers and cart them off to Guantanamo Bay or to some dungeon in South Carolina or whatever, torture them. It's important that keep them in jail forever. Even if a jury acquits them, have the military take control of them. I mean, this is the mindset over here, that Americans are seeing this package of anti-terrorist powers as freedom, a pro-freedom device to keep them safe from the terrorists or the drug dealers or the Muslims or the illegal aliens or whoever happens to be the communists, the official enemy of the day. The Egyptian people figured out that all of this is not a pro-freedom device. It's not a pro-freedom device that keeps people safe. It's, in fact, an inherent part of tyranny. This is why they risked their lives in revolution against their own government, in large part because of these anti-terrorist powers that Mubarak was exercising. And, of course, now Mubarak's gone, and he kept saying, well, look, it's temporary, I promise you it's temporary. We're going to lift these as soon as the war on terrorism and the war on drugs are over, and that could be fairly, well, we don't know when they're going to be over, but it's all temporary. Well, the people weren't buying it. They'd gone on with it for 30 years. They'd heard this temporary thing 30 years. I mean, look, Americans have heard this temporary thing for 10 years. Triple it. And that's what they were suffering under. Their friends, their neighbors being carted away in the dead of night, just disappearing, tortured, raped, brutally. I mean, as I suggested in the last few shows, there's a reason why the CIA entered into a partnership to have the Egyptian regime torture people on behalf of the CIA and the U.S. government. It's because the Egyptians are renowned for their torture. I mean, it's brutal torture. It's just vicious. And that's the whole idea of tyranny, and the Egyptian people saw that. Now they've got this military regime now, which is a delight for many people here in the U.S., people in the Pentagon and so forth, because for them this is like nirvana, man. Military rule. I mean, remember all the military dictatorships in Latin America that the Pentagon was installing and the CIA was installing, and U.S. officials were proud of. Why? Because of order and stability. You see, democracy's messy. It's just, you can't predict how people are going to vote or who they're going to put into office. Could be an anti-American regime, heaven forbid, like in Venezuela or something. Can't have that. And so, with a military dictator, you put some money in his pocket, make him happy. I mean, the U.S. government was giving $2 billion a year of U.S. taxpayer money collected by the IRS into the pockets of the military goons under Mubarak, and Mubarak too. I mean, the reports are coming out now is that he's a multimillionaire many times over. I mean, surprise, surprise. $2 billion can fund a lot of nice things. And so, this is the lesson. I mean, this is what Americans need to be, scratching their heads and thinking about and saying, wait a minute, how can a measure be pro-tyranny and pro-freedom at the same time? Now, let's talk about the part of the Constitution that deals with civil liberties. I mean, the Constitution is important to some people. I mean, you see the Tea Party movement, man. They're really hyped up about the Constitution. They carry their pocket constitutions with them and so forth. But what's interesting about it is that you hardly ever hear them talking about the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. And these are fascinating amendments, and they're critically important to a free society. And of course, you add on to that the habeas corpus provision in the original Constitution. It's not part of the Bill of Rights, but they all sort of come together. And, it's important that we understand the philosophy of these amendments. But before that, it's probably wise to do a little, reviewing again, like sometimes we do on this show, the review of fundamental principles. Remember that when Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, he's talking about fundamental rights, that man has been endowed with certain fundamental rights with which no government can legitimately interfere, even if it's a democratically elected government. We don't want the democratic vote to decide whether we're going to go to church. We don't want the democratic vote to decide what we're going to, eat for supper, or what we're going to read, or what we're going to do with our money, right? Well, liberals and conservatives believe in democratic votes to decide what you're going to do with your money. I mean, that's what all these welfare programs are about, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. But libertarians believe that, what you do with your money, that right is just as fundamental as whether you decide to go to church or not. I mean, it's your money, it's your property. But the whole idea that Jefferson's getting at is that government, even a democratically elected government, can't touch fundamental rights. That it's immune from democracy. And that's, of course, the idea of why democracy is dangerous, because people get this notion of, oh, well, we rule, so 95% of us want to force people to go to church, so I guess the other 5% is just going to have to go along until they get their people in public office. Well, no. Democracy is a nice way to vote people out of office, get new regimes in power so you don't have to have violent revolutions, but it's not a protector of individual rights. So when the Constitution was being discussed and people were deciding whether to bring the federal government into existence, imagine if the American people, our ancestors, had not approved the Constitution, we wouldn't have a federal government like we have today. We would still be operating under the Articles of Confederation. So people were very leery of this government. And why were they leery? Well, because their mindset was totally different from the mindset of modern day Americans, except for libertarians. I mean, our mindset pretty much mirrors our founding fathers with respect to the role of government in a free society. They viewed government as the biggest threat to their freedom. This is why they were extremely reluctant to permit the federal government to come into existence, because they said, you know what? If we let this government come into existence, it's going to end up like all the other governments in history, tyrannical, brutal, vicious, and we're just not going to, we don't want to have anything to do with that. Now they finally decide to go along with the deal, but the only reason for that is because they said, look, as a condition of going along with this deal of a government, we need a Bill of Rights here. But keep in mind that the Bill of Rights doesn't give people rights. That always shocks. I gave a lecture a few years ago at a public school where I said, first of all, I said, the main purpose of public schooling is indoctrination. And boy, they just went crazy on that. All the students, you mean to say we're being indoctrinated? These were like juniors and seniors. And I said, well, no, I'm saying you have been indoctrinated. And they just thought that was the funniest thing in the world. And then I said to them, well, the Bill of Rights doesn't give you any rights. And boy, they got furious and said, yes, it does. Yes, it does. And of course, I'm just smiling because it just proved my point, about the indoctrination. As I explained to them, the Bill of Rights is really a bill of prohibitions. It doesn't give people rights. Our ancestors understood that your rights don't come from the government. They don't come from the Constitution. They come from God. They come from nature. And, you have this Constitution calling into existence the federal government, but it's in a straitjacket. Its powers are very limited and very, enumerated. But even that wasn't good enough for the people. They said, no, we want express restrictions on power. Now, why did they want that? Because they knew that the federal government would attract the kind of people that would do bad things to the citizenry. Now, they may be well-intended. I mean, tyrants are well-intended. Mubarak was well-intended. All these dictators are well-intended. I mean, they don't sit there and say, I'm an evil person and I'm going to go out and do evil today. In their minds, everything they're doing is for the benefit of their children, which they consider the people of the country, that they're like the little steward of the children, that they're going to dole out an allowance and they're going to protect them from the scary creatures in life, the terrorists and the drug dealers and the illegal aliens and the communists and, on and on. Well, our ancestors understood the greatest threat is the government, because the government's going to attract status. People who just like they're just their DNA, it's just their makeup. They want power. They lust for power. And it's an insatiable lust. It can never be satisfied. They always want more and more and more. And they rationalize that what they're doing is for national security or for the benefit of the people. And we're doing this for your own good. And really, it's a psychological problem. It's something's going on inside them. But our ancestors had insight into human nature. They understood that government would attract the kind of people, including Congress, because notice that Congress is mentioned in the First Amendment. Now, the courts have held that the First Amendment applies across the board to the president, all the executive branch. But notice that the founding fathers, the framers, our ancestors, are talking about Congress in that First Amendment. Congress shall pass no law abridging freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom of religion, the right to peaceably assemble. Why mention Congress? Because they knew that Congress would attract the kind of people that are doing that. In other words, the Mubarak type people, or the little sheeplings in the Congress that go along with whatever the president says. If that's his party, yeah, okay, Mr. President, we'll do whatever you say out of party loyalty. This is the insight that our ancestors had. Why do you have a Second Amendment? Just to make it clear that you can't take away people's guns. As I mentioned, I think it was last week, that guns are the ultimate idea of gun ownership. We're seeing it in the Middle East. That's another valuable lesson. It's the ability to defend yourself against these cowardly, murderous, tyrannical goons that shoot demonstrators in the back or shoot them while they're sleeping in a park. And our ancestors understood that the federal government would attract people like that. They just want to disarm people. And so they wanted to clarify things. Well, it's the same thing with the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. But now notice that these amendments are different, because the rights that are explained in these particular amendments are different from the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Ninth Amendment. Different from what Jefferson's talking about in the Declaration, when Jefferson talks about natural, God-given, inherent rights. Well, these are not of that nature. This is, to a certain extent they are, like the right to be free of illegal searches, unreasonable searches and seizures. Well, overall, that's a right of privacy. But the notion of the search and seizure, or that you can't search a person without a warrant, these are not God-given rights. They arise in the context of government doing bad things to people. And specifically, one big bad thing: going out and seizing a person, carting him away, torturing him, and detaining him for the rest of his life, executing him without a trial. You see, this is what, in other words, behaving like Mubarak, behaving like Gaddafi, behaving like these other people in the Middle East. Now, you may say, well, yeah, but now they didn't have any experience like this. Jacob, there's just no way that our American ancestors were really talking about tyrants. They didn't have any experience like this with, like the people in the Middle East have. Are you kidding me? The British people, now keep in mind that in 1776, we're often taught in the public schools, they teach that the people that signed the Declaration of Independence, John Hancock, that they were great Americans. That's not true. They were not great Americans. They were great British. They were great Englishmen. They were as English as you and I are Americans. They were English citizens. And they were taking up arms the way they are in Libya against their own government, against the king who they called a tyrant. They were suffering under British tyranny, under the tyranny of their own government. And they decided to do something about it. They had reached a limit. It was like, enough, just like the Egyptian people have. Enough. Now you may say, well, Jacob, was the king really that tyrant? This is a British guy. This isn't a Muslim guy. He's a Protestant or a Catholic or, whatever. Excuse me. Have you ever heard of the Tower of London? Have you ever heard of the Star Chamber? The Star Chamber was these kangaroo tribunals, like the national security courts, which they have in Egypt under Mubarak. They still have them now under the military regime. They have them, over there in those tribunals in Guantanamo. This is a Star Chamber proceeding, was a proceeding where the verdict was cooked, where the defendant didn't have a chance. It was all rigged. It was to create the appearance of justice when there was no justice at all. It was just a way to do what you want to do to the guy, torture him, execute him, or whatever, but make it look like there was a trial. Okay, sound familiar? And of course, the Tower of London, we've all heard of the Tower of London. Go Google it. Look at the pictures. I'm sure they got some nice, gruesome torture devices. Very likely these Egyptian torturers are pikers, the Syrian torturers. The people the CIA hired to torture on their behalf are pikers compared to some of these British kings. They'd just go out and grab somebody that they didn't like, that maybe he was making a little bit too much trouble, criticizing the government, complaining about the high taxes, riling up the people. The king wouldn't torture himself. In most cases, he'd get his goons to do it, his military. This was the whole idea of a standing military, that the military would follow orders. This was their king. This was their commander-in-chief. If the king said, go pick up that guy, he's a threat to the realm, the soldiers would follow orders. And this is one of the reasons why our founding fathers were so much against a standing military, a standing army. I mean, we're seeing it in the Middle East, these militaries that the Pentagon has been building up, the Congress has been funding, they've been training them and so forth. They're now being used and have been used for decades to oppress their own people. Well, this is what the king would do. Most of you, if you're libertarians, I'm sure you've seen Braveheart. Recall that scene where it's the very beginning of the movie where the king has authorized the British lord to go off to this wedding party, and any wedding party, and pick up the bride and take her away on her wedding night to be raped by the British lord. I mean, this was like a reward to the British lord for his loyalty to the king. And he'd always take a military contingent, well armed, and the people were disarmed. The husband couldn't do anything. You recall in that scene, he wanted to fight, but his wife said no, don't do anything, because she knew that if he fought, if he resisted the rape of his wife by this British government official, that they'd just kill him, they'd torture him, they'd make an example of him. It was like, I think sometime in that movie, a strike on the soldier of the king is a strike on the king itself, the king himself. And of course, that's the whole idea of gun control, or sword control, that you can't resist when the goons are raping you or torturing you or doing these kind of things. And of course, then finally, when William Wallace's wife is killed, you reach a tipping point where people say enough's enough. And that's, of course, what's happened in Egypt. It's what happened in 1776. The British colonists said enough's enough. Now, one of the fascinating things about the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments, and these are all amendments designed to protect people from the power of the king, the power of the dictator, democratically or whatever, to go out and just seize people, cart them away to prison, torture them, and kill them. And one of the most fascinating parts of this whole thing is stretches all the way back to the year 1215, and it was in that year that the great barons of England had finally reached their breaking point with King John, their own king. But what they said to the king, and this was the beginning of the concept of limited government. You see, all of a sudden, you've got this omnipotent king, omnipotent powers, can go out and pick up anybody he wants, torture them, whatever. He can take their property, he can do whatever he wants. All of a sudden, these barons of England, they hold King John at the point of a sword. They didn't have any guns back then, but it was a sword. And they beat him. They beat their own king, and they said, look, we are requiring you to acknowledge that your powers over us are limited. And one of the biggest limitations in this power is that you will no longer have the power to seize us and cart us away to prison in violation of the law of the land. Now, that phrase, law of the land, would work its way up through the centuries. Century after century, there was resistance to tyranny, and it would gradually become a phrase that is commonly known today as due process of law. And so that's how that phrase is in the Fifth Amendment. It stretches all the way back to the Great Charter, to the Magna Carta, in which the people of England said, oh no, you're not. You're not going to do what you've been doing. You're not going to just cart us away. You're going to have to go through a process, and that process is going to have to be consistent with the law of the land. You're going to have to go before a judge if you want to incarcerate us. You're going to have to prove our guilt. And so it was these rights, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments, were born, not people didn't get them through God or nature. They were born in centuries of resistance to British tyranny by the British people. Gradually, habeas corpus. I mean, obviously, habeas corpus is not a God-given right like, freedom of speech or the right to keep and bear arms or the right to spend your own money and accumulate wealth and so forth. It's a legislative vehicle, and it comes into existence because really, habeas corpus is the linchpin of a free society. I mean, if you don't have habeas corpus in a society, and this is what the British people discovered. They discovered it in resistance to the tyranny of their dictators. For example, I mean, let's say that the king has got this this thing. He's going to go out and arrest somebody. He doesn't like somebody, and he takes them away to the Tower of London and he's torturing them. And they say, well, wait a minute, you promised at Runnymede, in 1215 that you wouldn't do this, and this is binding on future kings, and what are you doing? Well, nothing can happen. I mean, the king says, tough. Well, the idea behind habeas corpus is that the person can have his lawyer go to a judge and ask the judge for a petition for writ of habeas corpus. And the judge issues the writ, and it commands the king to bring, or the soldier, to bring that person before the judge and show cause why they're holding him. So if the judge says, if the soldier says, well, I didn't like the way he looked at me, well, the judge can order him released. And the judge will order him released. And if the soldier doesn't obey, the judge holds him in contempt and cites him for a prison sentence until he complies with his order. And of course, this depends on an independent judiciary, a judiciary that's courageous, it's willing to stand up to the executive branch, to stand up to Congress. But that was the whole idea behind three branches of government in the Constitution. And so this is the whole idea of the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments, to provide a vehicle, a protection, guarantees, barbed wire entanglements that inhibit the executive branch or Congress from simply seizing people, carting them away, doing what Mubarak does, carting them away, torturing them, disappearing them, and so forth. Now, where does the enemy combatant doctrine come in this? Well, the enemy combatant doctrine was announced after 9/11. Now, we've heard it all over and over again. So trite. 9/11 changed the world. 9/11 changed the world. Well, it changed the world only in the sense, not in the sense of U.S. foreign policy. I mean, what the U.S. government was doing prior to 9/11 that gave rise to the anger and hatred that motivated the 9/11 terrorists, the sanctions against Iraq that was killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children, all of it. I've talked about this. Well, they just continued that after 9/11 with their invasion of Iraq to effect the regime change that the sanctions had not achieved, the invasion of Afghanistan when they refused to extradite bin Laden without evidence, and the occupations, the brutality, the torture. I mean, they just continued what they had been doing before that led up to 9/11. What changed was the unilateral decree that now the U.S. government possessed powers that it had never possessed before. You see, for some 200 and some odd years since the Constitution was enacted, the American people had been concerned about the possibility that the federal government would wield this kind of dictatorial power. But that was the idea behind a Constitution, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. That was the idea of due process of law, stretching back to Magna Carta. It's like, you can't do this. But there were those in power that wanted to do it, especially with respect to the war on drugs. Now, we've talked about the war on drugs in this program. We're going to talk about the war on drugs in the future because it is one of the most monumental infringements on freedom that you could ever get. I mean, it is the excuse for infringements on freedom. It's corrupt. You got judges on the take, prosecutors on the take. It's deadly. You got how many people now dead? 30,000 in Mexico in the last 3 or 4 years alone. You got massive infringements on liberty in Mexico at the hands of their own military. But they'd been chomping at the bits. There have been massive infringements on liberty in the area of search and seizure. I mean, I don't know what the percentage would be, but I'd say 89% of the search and seizure cases in this country are drug-related cases. I mean, they've been making massive assaults. This has been just a disaster as far as privacy, financial privacy. There's these requirements of reporting, that you have too much cash when you're leaving the country or coming in the country, or the banks, reporting people are carrying in cash and stuff. That all started with the drug war. But what they couldn't get what they wanted, and that was the ability to just go out and pick up drug dealers and just cart them away, torture them, execute them, and forget a trial. They're guilty, they're drug dealers. The government caught them, I mean, that's the power that Mubarak had when he was dictator. I mean, his emergency powers came as a result not just of the war on terrorism, but also the war on drugs. Now, you got to give credit where credit's due. Mubarak went to the parliament, the Egyptian parliament, and asked for these powers, and he did it, oh, surprise, surprise, at the height of an emergency. The president of the country had been assassinated, and man, there was this, state of emergency, and oh well, we need these extraordinary powers, and please give me these powers, and they're only temporary. I promise you, I'll relinquish them back. And so it was the power to arrest people and torture them and execute them with no trial and so forth. And it was essentially the enemy combatant power. And temporary turned into 30 years, and he still didn't want to relinquish it after 30 years. It was temporary. Well, that's what happened with 9/11. But 9/11, President Bush didn't even go to Congress. His position was that he's a commander-in-chief, and he put on his commander-in-chief helmet, and he says, I'm a commander-in-chief, and we're at war now. We're at war against terrorism, and I can do whatever I want as a commander-in-chief, and I've got now the enemy combatant powers, and I've got the power to order my goons, or he didn't say goons, but he says my military and my CIA and my police forces to go out and arrest anybody, not only here in the United States, anyone in the world that he was suspecting of being a terrorist. And if they were accused of being a terrorist, that was it. Game over. And they built up this prison camp at Guantanamo Bay, and that was for the terrorists. And that was to have a constitution-free zone. Now the irony of this is that we all know that the military takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution. But you see, in their minds, when they obey the president, that is supporting and defending the Constitution. Their loyalty is to the president. Their loyalty is to their commander-in-chief. And whatever he says is ipso facto constitutional. And so that's why you didn't ever have one soldier, one officer, challenge Guantanamo Bay. Well, except for some of the military defense lawyers did. But except for them, I don't know of any officer or enlisted man that took a public stand against this thing, even though it was specifically designed to be a constitution-free zone. I mean, the whole idea of Guantanamo in the beginning was no federal court interference, where the federal courts are enforcing constitutional provisions. We're not going to have interference by Congress. We're not going to have interference by anybody. The powers were at Guantanamo, as originally intended, were going to be complete. They were going to be as complete as Mubarak's military powers in Egypt for 30 years. That they would be able to arrest anybody they wanted, anywhere in the world, kidnap them, bring them into custody, fly them over to Guantanamo, torture them, whether it's physical torture or touchless torture, the sensory deprivation, the idea of driving people mad, crazy, hold them there for the rest of their lives. That was the original idea. The U.S. military was going to show the world and the American people how the cow was going to eat the cabbage. They were going to have order and stability. None of this democracy stuff and interference with. We're not going to have trial by juries. Juries are unpredictable. They might acquit people. We're going to have military officials run these tribunals. It was a way of life that they were establishing at Guantanamo that was totally alien to everything Americans had ever heard of, at least in this country. I mean, we'd heard of it in dictatorial regimes. We had never heard of it here in the United States. Now, okay, some of it in the Lincoln regime, no question about it. But by and large, this was going to be a permanent feature, the Guantanamo Bay situation. The irony of this is that, it was located on this side of Cuba that came about as when the U.S. government turned toward imperialism in the 1898, the Spanish-American War. Well, I happened to be visiting Cuba during the time when they were trying an accused terrorist, a guy that they said had ties to the CIA that was blowing up hotels in Havana. Now, ironically, that's sort of back in the news because the feds are prosecuting a guy named Jose Posada Carriles right now in El Paso for falsely declaring that he had nothing to do with that particular hotel bombing. Well, I happened to be staying in one of the hotels where this bombing took place. It was kind of eerie because they had the guy on trial that was accused of doing the bombing, and it was on nationwide TV. So you could walk around the streets and you'd see these TVs in people's homes or in public places, and so forth. I mean public, I mean government. I mean everything is government owned in Cuba. It's like a liberal's dream. But what was fascinating about the procedure was the procedures that they were following in this tribunal was exactly the procedures that are being followed at Guantanamo. I mean, I sometimes wonder if they copied them or something. It's really fascinating. But this was the whole idea of 9/11. To take advantage of this emergency, because U.S. officials are not dumb. They're no different from any other government official around the world. No different from Mubarak. I mean, Mubarak took advantage of the big hype, the emergency when the president got assassinated. He got some emergency powers, extraordinary powers. Those same extraordinary powers, U.S. officials self-acquired, self-assumed, self-adopted with the 9/11 emergency. And now, I know statists hate it when you bring up Hitler because they say, "Oh, don't bring up Hitler." But bringing up Hitler is important sometimes because he's sort of like the gold standard on tyranny. I mean, nobody's going to question that Hitler was a tyrant, right? Well, if you want to get a good sense of how the tribunals operate in Guantanamo, go check out a movie called Sophie Scholl: The Final Days. Because there's a tribunal there that were trying members of the White Rose. It's a great movie. You'll absolutely love it. And they were trying members of the White Rose, these 21, 22-year-old kids, and the tribunals, and the verdict was cooked. Everybody knew what the verdict was going to be. It was going to be guilty in execution of these college kids. And the tribunal guy, the judge, I forget his name now, but it was the People's Court, and he was this famous guy that ran the People's Court, and he was berating these youngsters. Oh, your parents brought you up wrong and stuff because you dare to challenge authority and you dare to challenge the state, and you're not patriots and you're traitors because all they were doing was passing out pamphlets saying that our government's in the wrong and it's time to challenge our government, oppose our government because it's doing bad things. Well, that was their big crime. Their system was running this way. Now, ironically, Hitler did the same thing. Now, whatever you may say about Hitler, you can't say he was dumb when it comes to power. How did he get these extraordinary powers, the enemy combatant type powers, the anti-terrorist powers? Well, he got them at the height of an emergency. That was during the Reichstag fire, where you had, now some people think that Hitler did it, his people did it in order to create this emergency that then he would use as an excuse to scare people into giving them these extraordinary powers. But the people that were accused of it were terrorists and communists. Okay, sound familiar? And so they went on trial, and Hitler said, "Oh, we're under siege by the terrorists." He was declaring war on terrorism, and there was this big emergency. Imagine if the Congress had burned down right now, if the terrorists had bombed the Congress and burned it down. I mean, you can imagine you'd have Patriot Acts out the gazoo, right? Well, that's what Hitler did. We're under threat by the communists. And, remember all the stuff with the U.S. government and the communists and during the Cold War and so forth? Well, Hitler was using this after the Reichstag fire in the terrorists, because, these were terrorists that firebombed the Reichstag. And so he goes to the Reichstag, and he gets these extraordinary powers, enemy combatant powers, the powers to pick up people, torture them, execute them, no trial, whatever. And now the regular courts were running, but they acquitted some of these defendants, and guess what happens? Well, that's what caused Hitler to go establish his national security court, the People's Court. That you can't have acquittals, he said. I mean, don't you see this today when people are saying, "Well, we ought to establish a national security court"? Well, for what? We got federal courts trying terrorist cases. Oh, well, no, they might acquit. The juries might acquit. We can't have that. That was Hitler's position too, and that's why he established the People's Court to have the aura of justice, but it was really just a sham. Now, when you look at Guantanamo Bay, the original idea was no attorneys. I mean, they hate attorneys, criminal defense attorneys, and they weren't going to tolerate that because these are terrorists, you see, and you had a presumption of guilt, and so no presumption of innocence there at Guantanamo, presumption of guilt, and so since they were presumed guilty, it was okay to torture them, do any sorts of things, because these are terrorists. You see, they're guilty, even without being found guilty. And, of course, no trial by jury at all. I mean, the juries are regular citizens. They're dumb. They're ignorant. They come back in with acquittals and things like that. We need smart people, smart military officials, or, smart judges, like a national security court where they've gone to these elite law schools and stuff. And, well, there's a reason why our founding fathers put that trial by jury in there, is because they knew that regular people have a sense of justice, a sense of right and wrong, that lawyers and the military and judges just don't have all the time. They end up with this jaded law and order, approach of, we have to have stability and order, as the military puts it, which of course means convict everybody that they are accusing of being a terrorist. Well, now you may say, but Jacob, we're at war, and that's of course what they said, and that's what Hitler said, and that's what Mubarak said. But the fact is, terrorism is a crime. It's a criminal offense. You don't believe me? Then, go look in any newspaper, look on the internet, and you'll see any number of terrorist cases that are being tried in federal court. Zacarias Moussaoui, does that name ring a bell? He was one of the 20th hijackers for 9/11, tried in federal court, convicted. Any number of these people have been tried in federal court and convicted, or acquitted. Of course, some of them have been acquitted by juries, which just drives the state as batty. And the Pentagon's position post 9/11 is that they now have superior powers over the federal judiciary, the judiciary established by the Constitution. Their position is that if a person is acquitted of terrorism in a federal district court, they don't have to honor that ruling, despite the double jeopardy clause that our ancestors inserted in that Constitution, that they can go out and pick that guy up and keep him and give him a life in prison term, torture him, treat him like a terrorist, despite the fact he's been acquitted. All that's post 9/11. Now, what they did was they took a criminal offense, terrorism, and they made it into a war. It was like, a war on the mafia, or a war on crime, or war on drugs. War on drugs is the best example, because that's where the next step is. If some of this moves over from Mexico, this violence, I mean, they've been killing federal judges, prosecutors, and stuff in Mexico as part of this drug war. If that moves over into the United States, imagine if some drug cartel blows up a federal building where, they're getting ready to prosecute some drug lord or something, killing a bunch of federal officials. You're going to start hearing these same things that they did with terrorism. Terrorism is a crime, and they said, oh, well, now that we've declared war on terrorism, which is, like a tactic, we can now be a commander-in-chief, and now the full panoply of powers that are inherent to dictatorial regimes is now ours. They didn't go to Congress and ask for these powers. They just said, we are commander-in-chief. The president said that. Now Obama takes the position, and the military fully supportive. We will follow your orders, Mr. President. Give us your orders, and we will obey them. And so they go out and pick up whoever they decide the terrorist is, and they just incarcerate, no trial. Now, I shouldn't say no trial, because there are trials. But you see, the fascinating part of this is they have the choice. I mean, you couldn't find a better example of the violation of the rule of law. You hear that term, the rule of law. It doesn't mean like U.S. officials often say, oh, it means you got to obey the law. That's not what the term means. It's a term that goes back centuries into British law that says that people respond to a well-defined law, that everybody's going to be treated the same under that law. It's like equal treatment under law. That's not the case now. You get some people that get privileged positions, and they get the due process route. They get the federal court route. They get all the constitutional guarantees, right of trial by jury, speedy trial, and so forth. Over here, the less privileged, they get the shaft. They get the ugly system, the dictatorial system, the tyrannical system, where lawyers have their conversations monitored by the government with their clients. They've got no speedy trials. I mean, imagine. There's a constitutional protection against, delay in trial, so that people don't have a trial hanging over their heads. There's reasons why our founding fathers put these guarantees in there. There's been people in Guantanamo for 10 years, and they still don't have a trial. And of course, not that a trial would do them any good. It's just a kangaroo proceeding. They're all going to be found guilty. It's just a political deal. I mean, there was a guy named David Hicks. I don't know if you recall. He was an Australian there that had been at Guantanamo, tortured, and he was right before he was going to get tried. they entered into a political deal because the Australian president was running for re-election and it was hurting his re-election chances, and so they cut a deal. I mean, it's an ugly system, and that's what these people have done to us. And you know, their idea was that they were going to send a message to the world on how the cow's going to eat the cabbage. They were going to have a Pax Americana. They were going to show the terrorists all over the world that you don't buck the empire. People think that torture sometimes is just to get confessions or to get information. Nonsense. There's a reason why Mubarak tortured people, why the U.S. Government's Shah of Iran tortured people for 25 years until they threw him out of office. There's a reason why everybody tortures, all these regimes torture people, and it's to send a message. To send a message to other people within that society, this is what's going to happen to you. That's how the Iranian dictators have been able to suppress all their demonstrations. They just took a few of these young people, the leaders of these demonstrations, people in their teens or 20s, and tortured the heck out of them and then just killed them. And that sent a message to everybody else saying, this is what lies in store for you. And that was the whole idea of Guantanamo Bay. That was the whole idea of Abu Ghraib and Bagram and all these secret prisons, is that anybody that bucks the empire, this is what lies in store for you. It was a message. Well, it actually boomeranged. Exact opposite happens. It just engendered more anger, more hatred. You add that on top of the invasions, the occupations, the sanctions, the embargoes, the support of the dictatorships. The anger and rage just keeps growing and growing. And of course, then the terrorist retaliation comes, and it'll probably come again because they're still doing it. And then that's what they use then as the excuse for a new emergency to then take away more of the civil liberties. Now, Americans think, oh, well, they can't do this to Americans. It's only to foreigners, you see. It's okay because it's keeping us safe. It's a pro-freedom device to keep us safe. Well, that raises the case of Jose Padilla. And people used to ask us libertarians, why are you guys, supporting Padilla? What's the deal with you guys? Well, it's because we understood what the feds understood. And that Padilla was just the test case. That if you're going to go and try to get these extraordinary powers sustained against your own people, and you're going to have to get them sustained through the courts, because ultimately the Supreme Court took jurisdiction over Guantanamo. The whole dream of a constitution-free zone went out the window when the Supreme Court intervened and granted habeas corpus rights, or recognized habeas corpus rights for everyone there. But then they went after Padilla, and they tortured the heck out of him. Now, it was mostly touchless torture. They didn't waterboard him 183 times like they did with the foreigners and so forth. But they had, remember those goggles? If you look on the internet and Google, Jose Padilla goggles, you'll see that they had these goggles that prohibited him from seeing anything or hearing anything. And this idea came about from the North Korean communists, who discovered that if you do this, if you isolate a person, sensory deprivation, they go crazy. I mean, they have mental damage, permanent mental damage. That's what they were doing to Padilla. And the reason that we were fighting this is because the feds knew, and we knew, the libertarians knew, that whatever happened to Padilla applied across the board to all Americans. I mean, they picked Padilla because they knew the average American would say, I ain't going to stand up for a terrorist. No way, man. I'm going to support the government's power to arrest Americans or arrest Padilla, and torture him and do whatever they want to him because we're at war. Well, they didn't realize, most Americans, deferring to authority and so forth, that what the feds were doing was using Padilla to get the law established that they could do what Mubarak does to his people, that they could do it to their people too. And this is what the shame of our generation's living today, that for the first time in American history, after 250 years or so, where the government couldn't do these things, the things that our founding fathers, the framers, were concerned about, just going out and picking up people and torturing them and so forth, they got away with it. They got away with it, and they've gotten away with it for 10 years. They've had this power of just going out and picking up and doing everything they did to Padilla. They can do to any American. That's the law now. Now, interestingly enough, they played some cute little games with the Supreme Court. It's amazing that the Supreme Court let them get away with this. But they kept telling the Supreme Court and the courts that Padilla was a dangerous enemy combatant, that the federal courts were not suited for him. But as soon as they got a favorable ruling out of the Court of Appeals, the Federal Court of Appeals, They were scared that the Supreme Court might not sustain that. They had this ruling under their belt. They had it in hand that now applied to all Americans. They shifted Padilla over to the federal court system and called him a criminal defendant. I mean, if that's not the most disgraceful legal sham maneuvering, I don't know what is. But they got what they wanted. They got the law established that they can do this. Now, granted, they're not rounding up people like Mubarak was doing, like Gaddafi was doing, and so forth, but they got it in their hip pocket now. All you need is the right emergency, and they got the enemy combatant power to go out and start grabbing people, cart them away to concentration camps, the way they did like the Japanese Americans in World War II. And the shame of this, the great shame that we, the Americans living today, is that we let it happen. We traded liberty for security. Now, when I say we, I'm talking about the generations living today. That it was all, oh, but Jacob, I wanted to be kept safe. I wanted to be kept safe. I didn't care about my freedom, you know. And so you got all these little chickens that are relinquishing to the fox the power to do these things. And, you know, every so often one of the chickens disappears and the other chickens don't ask any questions, you know, defer to authority, support the troops. They know what's best. They have information that we don't know. And nobody asks any questions about, why that chicken disappear. It's just and the numbers of chickens just keep getting smaller and smaller. But the fox is there to take care of them. And now, where's the Patriot Act fit in all this? Well, the Patriot Act deals with the Fourth Amendment. It's a direct assault on the infringements of privacy of the American people, these national security letters, where they can just go to a bank and financial institution and get all your records without even letting you know. You have no ability to contest it. These little sneak and peek things where they can come into your house. Effectively, they can come in and search whatever they want. I mean, the floodgates are open. As long as it's a terrorism-related thing, which, opens up the floodgates to anything, because they know nothing's going to happen to them anyway. They've tortured people in violation of law. They've killed people in violation of law. They've killed prisoners. They've executed prisoners, and nothing's happened to them. They destroy videotapes. They destroy evidence. Nothing happens to these people, and they know it. Do you think anything's going to happen to them for going and conducting an illegal search? I mean, these are the times we're living in, okay? And it's what I've said from the very first time I started the show. Americans need to start doing some soul searching. It's not just enough to be paying lip service to the Constitution. Oh, I've got my copy of the Constitution. It's time that we start looking at these things seriously, at what our founding fathers intended. Did they intend for us to be living under an empire that was out invading and occupying countries and torturing people and kidnapping people and having constitution-free military zones and so forth? Did they intend to have this huge military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us was a threat to our democratic processes? Did they intend a massive welfare state where the IRS is one of the most terrifying organizations in history and goes and seizes money and property from people in order to give it to other people? Did they intend for us to have a paternalistic welfare state where the government's taking care of us with all these tyrannical, paternalistic devices like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and so forth? Did they intend for us to be living under this horrible tyranny of a drug war where they're destroying people's lives, sending people to jail for 10, 20, 30 years for just an ounce or two of marijuana because they have the audacity to ingest a substance that hasn't been approved? And did they intend for us to be living under a regime that has the power to seize people, to cart them away, to torture them mentally and physically? No trial, no due process of law. You know what my answer to this is, and that's the beauty of libertarianism. That we don't take liberty as ad hoc, oh, well, we favor freedom of speech but not gun rights, or gun rights but not freedom of speech. For us, freedom is something, it's an entirety. We place value on all aspects of human freedom: economic liberty, civil liberty, religious liberty, political liberty. We look at the individual with dignity, with respect, with the idea that he has a right to live his life free of these tyrannical controls. If he does something wrong, then fine, prosecute him, follow the rules. But none of this stuff that's inherent to these dictatorial, tyrannical regimes. That's the soul searching that we need to continue doing as Americans. We need to revitalize what it means to be free. And that means going back to founding principles, the principles of our country. If we do this, then we can get this country back on the right road, the road to freedom, prosperity, and harmony and morality. Thank you very much. That's the show for this week. Thanks for listening in. See you next week.